Welcome to the 24-hour conference on global organised crime podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I'm Jack Megan-Vickers. The 24-hour conference on global organised crime took place online in November 2020 and was organised by the European Consortium of Political Research Standing Group, the Centre for Information and Research on Organised Crime, the International Association for the Study of Organised Crime, and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Hundreds of academics, researchers, journalists and others from around the world gathered together to present and discuss the latest research in organised crime. We've selected just 14 of them for this podcast series, but I would encourage you to head over to the website oc24.globalinitiative.net where you can find recordings of other sessions. In this episode, you'll hear the session, Latin American Drug Crimes.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to you all. My name is Yorela Islas, and I am one of the speakers, and I will also be moderating this panel on Latin American drug crimes. We're going to have a total of 3 different presentations. The first one will be by Jorge Mantilla. He is a PhD candidate, and his dissertation looks at the ways armed groups, local gangs, and law enforcement exploit, recruit, and victimize migrants facing vulnerabilities in the context of ongoing proxy wars between Venezuela and Colombia. Jorge has worked as a practitioner and analyst with public agencies and international organizations on topics related to armed conflict, public safety, and drug trafficking. His current interests are crime and governance, international migration, and urban violence. His presentation is titled Street-Urban Peace in Contested Informalities, the Hidden Face of Colombia's War on Drugs. Over to you, Jorge.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for being here, putting this conference together. So this is a presentation based on a paper that is kind of forthcoming in the Journal of Illicit Economies and Development from LSE. Is based on the case of the biggest open drug market in Colombia. There was intervened back in 2016. And basically the paper, it's looking at 3 main questions, which are the architecture of illegal drug markets, how after state interventions or crackdowns, operators in these markets intend to adapt to these state interventions. And this question is basically drawing on a kind of contradiction or apparently antagonism between public safety policies and then public health policies. And is looking at how can we kind of mix or reconciliate social policies with organized crime control or crime control policies in the context of Latin America. And also, that question is also building another one, which is how everyday interactions from the aftermath of state interventions kind of inform these interagency efforts in drug security and social policies. So just kind of a little bit of context. I'm drawing on the kind of literature which is looking at criminal resilience and criminal governance, which is, as many of here know and work in that, looking at how criminal groups govern based on the assumption that sometimes it's in the best interests of criminal groups or organized crime groups to provide public goods such as street justice, security, social services, and how many times, contrary to like the mainstream assumption on organized crime, let's say, criminals and the state are not always in opposite sides of the law. So I'm looking at contested informalities, which I define as kind of the everyday hustle that a lot of underserved communities have to go through in order to survive in the context of urban criminal control. We are talking here, as I will speak later, of the off the books economy that happens at the street base, such as street vending, sex work, private security, informal transportation, informal housing, and how in these urban crime ridden areas or urban margins, these illegal markets kind of overlap with urban informality and with poverty. And there's a paradox about that, and is the fact that in many of these places, despite all the hardship and the kind of underserved communities that live there, these markets are actually very profitable and they make a lot of money in this context of contested informalities. In the case of the Bronx, following Beckert and Dewey kind of definition or classification of different type of markets, what happened here was that all these kind of markets were functioning in this urban crime-ridden hub. So we had markets in which the good or the service was illegal as such as, for example, drugs, markets of stolen legal goods, such as, for example, automobile spare parts or smartphones, markets of falsified, counterfeit, or forged goods, legal products traded in illegal ways, and of course, legal markets in which regulations were not observed. For example, in this case, it was the fact, as I'll show later, for example, parties or liquor consumption for underaged or for teenagers. Everything of that happened. So I'm building the first paradox in this context was, or the first question was, what happens when crime goes okay? And this is, as a criminologist, we know that we kind of study crime when crime goes wrong, when there's a tug war, when the homicide rate is spiking, where violence comes, or where actually kind of crackdowns happens. But we often do not pay a lot of attention to the when organized crime actually goes okay. And this is the case of Bogota. You know, like Colombia has 3 main cities. And the first, like there are Cali, Medellin, and Bogota. Medellin is very famous, as you can see, and you know all this history of Pablo Escobar and Medellin cartel. Cali as well had a cartel, but Bogota was never regarded as a crime city. And this was basically by the fact that, as you can see, the homicide rate per 100,000 inhabitants was very low compared to other cities. This is like what David Bergman defines as a low equilibrium crime city. These are cities where there are like high crime rates in terms of, for example, robbery or property-oriented crimes, but there are not actually violent cities if you consider them as a whole. The paradox too, as I was talking before, was how to make money out of the disadvantaged or the most disadvantaged or the slum. This is building literature on inner cities, the slum, favelas. In the case of Colombia, you can see it as comunas, but we're talking about these underserved communities. I'm looking here at what we call the micropolitics of crime, and it's basically how that crime is organized based on everyday kind of arrangements between criminals and the state. And you know, like this concept of state sponsor protection rackets from Duran Martinez and Snyder is looking precisely at these kinds of arrangements. So what we were seeing here was that there was criminal control, law enforcement performed some social control functions, local gangs, others. I don't want to kind of spend a lot of time here, but there was kind of a coordination in between criminals and the state for these open air drug market kind of to work and to work properly. And using crime script analysis, a criminological technique, kind of looking to the background process or processes that need to happen for this kind of organized crime, where social resources need to be kind of set up. Was like how the social order of the Bronx actually looked like the gray points, drug selling, stolen goods handling, and kind of diversion, bar pools, liquor stores was the way in which a person could enter this market. But the market had different kind of, developments regarding if you were there to buy or consume like drugs on the base of retail, or you were kind of doing bigger transactions, trying to kind of stocking warehouses, arms trafficking, satellite market supply. But here, what is important in terms of the research question that I was asking in the first place was how successful criminal organizations are those that are flexible enough in order to respond with the proper amount of security and efficiency to these interventions. In this case, despite that the Bronx as the urban space was cracked down, was demolished, and actually like an urban renewal project was ongoing, these gangs or local gangs try to kind of adapt. And here, it's a kind of very important governance in which territory is regarded as a very, very important asset in order to perform criminal governance. Like some of the mainers would say that without territorial control, criminal groups cannot perform governance. And the opposite, what I saw here in this particular case was that social control was even more important than territorial control. Because what happened was that there were social workers and all that is called like therapeutic policing or policing as peace building. We're talking about like mixed teams between police officers, social workers, counseling centers, trying to, rescue homeless people, drug users from the criminal control and all these kind of rules that I was telling you before. For example, mugging was not allowed inside of this market. So after the crackdown, Bronx tried all local gangs managing this open air drug market tried to adapt. So my findings are like kind of 6. One of them is local gangs and law enforcement agents are not always in opposite sides of the law. I think that rather under specific circumstances, street level bureaucracies might further enforce criminal orders. As I said before, I think that fixed demand, like social control, is much more important for the functioning of criminal governance than territorial control. And when groups manage to control specific populations as irregular immigrants, for example, or homeless people or drug users, drug markets are more like a social kind of dynamic than a territorial one. Lastly, I would say that in this case, in cities and in Colombian cities, or deterring these places. And lastly, just like often parallel sets of regulations imposed by criminal networks might continue to operate after state. So I will leave it there by now. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you very much. I remind everyone that the questions will be made at the end, but you can still write them down in the chat. If you have a specific question for a speaker, please write it down in the chat as well so we know about it. So now it's my turn. My name is Yorela Islas. I have a PhD in politics, languages, and international studies from the University of Bath. So I'm a researcher and a consultant in national and international issues, including transnational organized crime, policies, asymmetric conflict resolution, and strategic convergence between illicit groups. My presentation is titled Progressive Use of Violence as an Enabler for Transnational Criminal Organizations, and I'm going to share it in a sec. Just give me a moment. So I'm going to talk about the case of Mexico. The first thing I guess we'll need to know is that Mexico has 130 million inhabitants, and well, it has 1,900 kilometers square. And well, since the beginning of the war on drugs, we had more than 8,000 deaths per year. At the beginning, we had 8,000 deaths, and then it went increasingly growing until we have about 22,000 deaths reported for the year 2017 and 23 reported for the year 2018. Now, what's about violence? The first thing we need to understand is that violence comes from the number that we see in terms of deaths, in terms of homicides and crimes, right? So this is what we normally see in the Mexican news and the Mexican reports about organized crime, in which you have a spike of violence between 2006 and 2015 or 16. And this is normally used in terms of different debates to show how much Mexico has become a violent country. However, when you see it in a time frame, you realize that in 1992 and 1993, we had spikes of violence that were similar to those that we lived until 2009. And it was until later that the violence spiked forward. In terms of what this means for the country, it is usually said that Mexico is a very violent country, but the violence is localized in different states. This chart that you can see down here represents all the states in Mexico. So each line accounts for one state reporting their homicides and their violence. Now, the relevance of this is that when you compare it with the normal line that we usually debate, which is the one that is on the top, the total violence in Mexico, it's very different. So considering that Mexico has the size of half of the European countries altogether, if we go back and we analyze the violence in context in each state, we can have different outcomes, and realizing that not all of the states in Mexico are very violent. And the violence comes from different causes in different states. Now, I've identified different causes for the violence, and that's what I'm going to present very briefly to you today. First one is, well, inter-cartel conflict violence. The second is intra-cartel conflict. The third is cartel versus gangs. The fourth, cartel versus the state. And the fifth, cartel versus the society. Again, the gangs can also fight the government due to military operations, creating a Medusa effect and generating eventually a war on drugs. Now, inter-cartel violence. So the main characteristics of this inter-cartel violence is the conflict between one cartel and the other one. This is due to enmities, to the assassination of family members, or for the control of territories. During the 2000s, for example, the Sinaloa cartel under Chapo Guzman's leadership decided to attack the cartel that was controlling the western part of Mexico, trying to get more control of the territory. At this point, the people that is affected is mainly the criminals, and civilian violence is very, very rare. The next type of violence is cartel versus gang. So at this point, the cartel differentiates from a gang in an aspect in which the cartels are very much organized, and their organization is greater in size and strategic expansion than the gangs. Now, the members of the cartels are fighting different gangs for the control. Again, they are going to try to take the leadership away of the gangs, to take control of the criminals. And well, the stronger the leadership and hierarchy of the organizations, the less the proclivity for violence, because they can reach agreements in which they are agreeing to have win-win situations in all fronts. Now, again, when you have this kind of violence, you can see the violence against civilians rising, not because the cartels and the gangs are attacking the civilians per se, but because the civilians are members of the gangs and the cartels. And when they start being killed and they die, they are counted as part of the civilian population, because it's not good looking to have a journal or to have a lot of people saying like, oh, well, a lot of people is being dead because they are members of the gangs. So normally that's where the mediatic interpretation and mediatic manipulation begins. Again, at the same time, we also have cartel versus cartel violence. This also refers to the war between the cartels to fight for control. The cartels versus the state violence. At this point, we have the cartels growing enough power to be able to challenge the state. Normally, in a normal criminal organizations / state relationship, the criminal organizations will try to hide from the state, because the state has the ability to crush the criminal organizations and their activities. However, when you have highly organized criminal organizations, they will eventually infiltrate enough institutions and pay off enough politicians and members of the law enforcement to be able to challenge the power of the state. So when the parts of the state try to control the crime back, they are going to fight back against the state. This has to do with the new security strategies. When the cartels have enough power to challenge the state will normally launch direct operations by either the police or sometimes the army, like the cases of Mexico and Colombia. And well, the violence will be seen in terms of shootings and different problems between the authorities and the criminal organizations. One of the most relevant examples of this was the case of the assassination or the capture and death of Beltrán Leiva in 2010, 2011. And the president came out on television and said that in a very interesting military and Marines operation, they had managed to kill this leader of a criminal organization in Mexico. And in retaliation, the organized criminal group went to the families of the military that participated on it, and they killed them all. So you start seeing retaliation from the criminal groups against civilians, but always related to the activities to the state. Now, you have also retaliations from the drug trafficking organizations against the civil society. And this is to limit the capacity of law enforcement. This is also due to the corruption between drug trafficking organizations and the government, and the impunity in which the criminal organizations are operating. At this point, you can see that the state is very weakened, not maybe in the institutions, but in the application of the law. So this is two parts of the same problem. You have a state that may be very strong in terms of institutional and budget, but in the application, it is very weak. At this point, the people that is affected are the civilians and the civilians, such as undocumented migrants. One of the best examples of this retaliation was the mass murder of 72 migrants in the state of Tamaulipas in 2010 by the Zetas. The Zetas were trying to make a statement about their power, their overall criminal power, and they killed 72 people all at once. And well, another example is the rehabilitation center massacres in Chihuahua. Basically, the criminal organizations and drug cartels in Chihuahua start going to rehab centers, killing the people inside, accusing them of being collaborators with either the authorities or other criminal organizations. Now, the identified causes of violence related to the government have to do with the strategies implemented by the government. So there is a risk that the implementation of strategies will create a spiral of violence. Every strategy generates a reaction from the criminal organization. So that's something that really needs to be taken into consideration by the authorities and the people that is planning such strategies. The magnitude of the reaction is related to the level of corruption, impunity, and development. I'm mentioning this because sometimes when we implement counter-narcotic policies or counter-criminal policies, it doesn't seem that the planation of such policies will include how the corruption of the state and the impunity of the authorities or the impunity perpetrated by the authorities will affect the implementation of the strategy. So at the end, if you don't realize that you as a state have a problem of corruption and impunity, it doesn't matter if you have a brilliant strategy. If you don't consider those two facts, your strategy will fail at the moment of the implementation. Now, the violence observed in the cases of Mexico are, well, three stages. First, we started with military operations in the 1980s, trying to control the production of heroin and marijuana. And then we have another strategy in the 90s, trying to target high-level personnel of the cartels, arresting them. But because we have corruption, the members that were arrested were still leading the cartels from inside jail. Then the third one is on the 2000, we have the war on drugs, and we have a lot of extraditions and a lot of elimination of the leaderships of the cartels. And, well, the last one is officials abusing the power against the criminals. After the war on drugs started, after the war on drugs started, we had the power that as there were many leaders of the cartels being killed, we had much more cartels than at the beginning. So the more cartels the more leaders you kill, the more cartels there will born from those, because there's vacuum of violence. So this is the main leaders of the cartels. But after they were detained or assassinated or killed, the cartels subdivided in many parts, and that's mainly what generated the big problem in Mexico. As you can see in these maps, this is the first one, 2006. We have a few cartels. Then on 2010, this had divided. In 2013, we had more. And then in 2015, you have a lot of different cartels trying to control different territories. And this will show in terms of violence. This is some images of the war on drugs. And, well, how did we see that in Mexico? We have the deaths per month per state. This is the chart that I showed at the beginning. And if you look at this, each peak of violence, and I'm signaling this, has to do with specific moments of the war, even one operation or one killing of one leader in the drug cartels. So if you go very specific at each peak of violence and each diminishing part of the violence, you will realize that it has something to do with different parts of the war on drugs at some point of history. And, well, what's up to do? We have hope. And this is a promise of hope. Every time there's a new administration, we have a new part of new strategies and new ideas against organized crime. However, every administration has not only the responsibility of having hope and of having a speech that they are going to do things better, but they have the responsibility of acknowledging which parts of the state are not working correctly. Just changing the name, like the new president is doing, or just creating new institutions because the old ones were wrong, does not really mean a de facto improvement of those institutions, because you're hiring the same people. An example is the change of the name of the judicial power in Mexico. They changed the name, but the people inside is the same. Hence, if you don't do an investigation of or a plan in which you can improve either collusion, or you can improve and diminish the possibilities for corruption or impunity. Even if you change the name, even if you disappear one organization and generate another one, the future will not change, because the implementation of the security policies will be affected by the same issues that all the governments are having, which are basically corruption and impunity, in which the criminals will be able to do whatever they want. And well, with that note, I will really ask to all the attendants here today to always remember that if you're ever in a position to do a public policy, security public policy, don't be scared of realizing what are the problems within your institutions that will prevent your policy at the moment of application, that will obstaculize that policy when it's applied by the same people you're trying to help. And with that note, I thank you for your attention, and well, that's over. So thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please just make them in the chat. Now I'm going to proceed to present our next speaker. So our next presentation will be made by three amazing speakers. The first one is William Gilberto Jimenez Garcia. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the Ministry of Science of Colombia. He's a doctor in social and human sciences, master in habitat, and bachelor in environmental management. His current work examines areas of violence, organized crime, drug trafficking organizations, and vulnerability. He currently leads the network of knowledge on violence and crime, La Red VICRI, for the name in Spanish. And the speaker that is going to talk with Williams is Natalia Bojorges Bedoya. She is the coordinator of GI-TOC research group at the Universidad Tecnológica de Pereira in Colombia. She is master in ecotechnology and bachelor's in industrial engineer. Her research interests are related to the field of statistics and engineering and education. The speaker that is also talking with them is Wilson Arenas Valencia. He is Dean of the Faculty of Business Science at the Universidad Tecnológica de Pereira in Colombia. He is a PhD candidate in projects, and he has a master's in statistics research, and a bachelor in industrial engineer. His research interests are related to systemic thinking. Their presentation is really interesting. The title of the presentation is The Relationship Between Drug Trafficking and Social Disadvantage with Homicide, a case study in the Colombian cities. And with that, I pass the word over to you guys. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. I share my thank you very much. We are pleased to be at this important event sharing our research results. Let's try to tell you from a common context, the particular situation of homicide in a Colombian city that is very connected to the global trade in goods and service. The city is Pereira, is close to Medellin and Cali, cities that in the cities works Jorge at the first presentation. This city has a strong market for drugs, both for local trade and for global trade of drugs. And this city has a high homicide rate, historical homicide rate. Can you see, we're talking about the Latin American city, similar, just like Rosario in Argentina, Belo Horizonte is the same history for these cities, these Latin American cities. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. Okay, Latin American, continue with this previous context. Let's look specifically at the case study and located geographically and politically. Latin America is the most violent region in the world. Nearly 2,500,000 people have died from violent causes in Latin America in the last 15 years. Colombia is a violent country. This is not a secret. Despite a dramatic reduction in homicide rates over the past 5 years, its homicide rates remain among the highest in the region. Among the causes for the murderous violence are the armed conflict that has lasted more than 6 decades, the debt, social inequality, and the drug trafficking, being in Colombia the main exporter of cocaine in the world. Based on the knowledge for the context, we consider those hypotheses in this research. In the first hypothesis, we propose that the homicides are produced by the social disadvantages accumulated in the territories. The second hypothesis is that the murders are caused by drug trafficking. Both hypotheses do not restrict us to the thinking that homicides are caused by multiple causes and that there is no linearity in the construction of homicide as a social, political, and ethical fact. However, we believe that there is a deficit in the knowledge of homicide despite the fact that in Colombia, 15,000 people have died each year on average, and that this deficit focus on understanding the multi-causality of homicide and on understanding how social variables influence homicide. We say this because a very common argument among politicians, social communicators, and academia itself is that homicide is produced in Colombia mainly by drug trafficking. We do not want to deny the drug trafficking is important, but because we are convinced that drug trafficking has a strong exploratory power. However, we believe that there are more causes, and this is what we want to demonstrate with this model. We understand drug trafficking as a set of activities that are carried out in a planned manner to produce and commercialize goods and services, in this case drugs, that are considered by the legal framework of almost all countries of the world to be illegal. Drug trafficking is a productive system based on scientific literature and technical knowledge of criminal operators. We have divided the chain of production and commercialization of drugs into 4 macro processes. You can see that process in this picture. In our research, we have concentrated on the 2 that occur or happen in the city of Pereira and that are traceable and measurable for us. In this case, DTV and DTC, commercialization and distribution. Remember, our city has two kind of market, a local market and global market. The indicators we work on this study were drug seizure and drug captures for the police for drugs such as cocaine, heroin, and marijuana. For us, social disadvantage are related to the ability of the population to access goods and service and to enjoy the rights and freedoms offered by the Colombian socialist state. With this definition, we are talking about material goods, intangible service and practice of good living. When a family cannot access these for these goods and service, freedom too, we are talking about it's being social disadvantage. The indicators we worked on this study were income of households and single parents household hidden by women. To estimate the relationship between homicide, just like a latent variable, and drug trafficking and social disadvantage. In the territorial units study, in this case, we use comunas and corregimientos, that is administrative unit, minimal administrative unit for Colombian legislation. We use the structural equation models because it allows us to simultaneously examine a series of dependency relationship using multivariate techniques such as regression and factor analysis, where homicides was the independent variable affected by non-observable or latent variables, in this case, drug trafficking and social disadvantage. PLS-SEM is a multivariate analysis technique whose purpose is to test structural models, in this case for 3 variables. We use in this study sampling methods. Our sample was composed for 31 comunas and corregimientos, 19 comunas in the urban area and 12 corregimientos in the rural area for Pereira. So that information has provided for the Police National Police of Colombia and Statistics National Department and Social Development Secretariat of Pereira. So this is our theoretical model. We believe that homicides are caused by the drug trade and social disadvantage. The drug trade, after a factorial analysis, we find that is the best explained as follows. Captors have a greater incidence on homicides than drug seizures. Scientific literature, I'm so sorry, is scared. However, we found a similar study in Mexico, for example. In Ciudad Juárez, a study found the relationship between captures and homicides. The context of this city in Ciudad Juárez is one in which drug trafficking organizations dispute the monopoly of drugs commercialization and drug routes to the USA. The seizures are related to the captures, which is hardly logical. Maybe. We decide not to measure the relationship between seizures and homicides because we did not find any evidence in the literature, and because seizures produce an economic impact and are a political event on the part of the authorities. Seizures destabilize the finance of the drug trafficking organizations, but they don't undermine the confidence of their members, for example, and the consequence violence, as if the capture were happening. That happened in the Colombian cities. I don't know in other Latin American cities, but in Colombia it happened. Here can see the evaluation of the models and the correlations of those evaluated. We see that a period of 10 years, since 2010, the loading are mostly, here the loading, are mostly highly significant for the indicators of the latent variables, if you can see. Also, the CR and ABE in most years is significant according to the levels exposed in several studies that apply the structural equation models. Finally, here we see the evaluation of the relationship, social disadvantage with violence, drug trafficking with capture, and capture with violence. With trafficking, remember, is seizure of drugs, of kind of drugs. We see that we see a more significant relationship between variables. Almost every year, we obtain significant the parts of variables evaluated in the model. We are struck by the variable of social disadvantages that obtain greater consistency and higher levels of significance than the variables of the drug trafficking. That is important results. Finally, for conclusion, we found enough evidence to accept the first hypothesis. Homicides are produced by social disadvantages, and we can say that because we can find in other literature, scientific literature, especially from the theory of collective efficacy, such as results have already been anticipated. But really in the habitat scale that not show the same results. For example, geographical sectors of cities where low income, for instance in Pereira, for low-income households are concentrated are more vulnerable to homicidal violence. Households that are solely female-headed tend to concentrate higher numbers of homicides. In this study, our area, these indicators are produced by situations such as the existence of an illegal drug market, the recruitment of minors by drug trafficking organizations, to the high levels of drug consumptions, and the absence of the states in these areas of these city inners. We believe that understanding the impact of social disadvantages will enable authorities to refine their strategies for reducing homicide and channel efforts and resources to address the problem. For example, policymakers with our finding may justify the creation of programs to improve household income or for family planning, or the violence of family parenting as a strategy for reducing homicide. The result we obtain in this study opens a new field of research to understand and counteract the impact of homicide in Colombia and Latin American cities. For example, we can investigate the influence of relationship of sexual rights, the role of mothers and fathers, and social cultural values of the family with issues such as crime prevention, criminal careers, organized crime, and citizen security management. For the second hypothesis, who relate homicide with drug trafficking, we can see in our study, there was no consistent evidence that allowed us to accept this hypothesis, as capture had no significant relationship with homicides. Given these results, we believe that it's necessary to consolidate methodologies that can more accurately measure the drug markets in cities and violence that this market generates. Since in our study, it was not possible to construct an accurate measure of drug trafficking. Perhaps with the data used, if we manage to prove the police operation against drugs, since the captures and seizures are made by the police at the action of this state agency, depends on the political will to confront the drug trafficking organization and to address the problem of drug marketing and consumption rather than actually reducing homicide in these cities. For example, in Pereira, it's very complicated because the drug trafficking organization leads the local government. It's clear that in order for drug trafficking to exist in a city, the traffickers need implementation of protective technologies, which are achieved by means of personnel specialized in the use of violence and and in the existence of weapons that guarantee harm and lethality in this practice, which is why it's obvious that in a place where there is drug traffic, homicidal violence is likely to occur. This results in the second hypothesis, which justifies an investigative process to measure the relationship between drug markets and homicides that can use more indicators than drug seizure and captures. For example, counting the money collected by criminal organizations, the number of children and young people who are recruited by drug trafficking organizations, the real operational capacity that drug trafficking organization has in the city, infrastructure, for example, infrastructure, personnel, I don't know, the capacity of the drug trafficking organization to corrupt public officials, individuals. Finally, I think that the other illegal markets that are operated with drug trafficking organization resources, arms, prostitution, illegal gambling, among others. So this is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. It was a very interesting presentation. And now we're going to go to the questions. I will ask you if you have a question, just to type it down in the chat if you can. So the first question is to Jorge from Carolina Sampo. She says, I really don't think, okay, that's not a question. Sorry. Tamia Brito, I think you have a question. Tamia, are you listening to me? Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sorry, I thought you were gonna ask them for me, but okay. Yeah, my question is to Jorge. I was wondering whether in your research, were you able to find information regarding local gangs interaction, not between the gangs per se and the governmental officials and authorities, but rather among themselves in terms of direct and indirect violence, and how those interactions may have taken place?
Thank you, Tamia. The thing here is that, remember, I was talking about a context in which state-sponsored protection rackets were going on. And this was the reason why there was such a low homicide rate in Bogota overall. So if it's true that there were like kind of violence in between, or competitive violence, following Peter Reuter's concept, competing violence between gangs, what is paradoxically here is that after the state crackdown on the drug market and the stress of their availability to sell drugs, what happened is that they relied on disciplinary violence towards their longtime clients and consumers in order to keep control of them. Because of course, state-sponsored protection rackets have two kind of key characteristics. The first of it is that the state capacity to enforce the law. So Bogota is the strongest city and has like the strongest local criminal justice system in Colombia. This means we have a police department who is capable of enforcing the law. And that is a key asset in order to sell protection, which was what was happening under the Bronx. They were selling protection, or they were selling enforcement against competitors. And the second characteristic is that the criminals or local gangs have the capacity to pay for their protection and to comply with the conditions of this protection. And these conditions were overall to maintain a low homicide rate. That's why they relied most of all not on competitive violence, but on disciplinary violence. And that's related to the comment of Carolina as well, which I agree with, is that the fact that in Latin America, violence is so normalized and there's a moral economy of violence.
in this particular case, it was so much normalized because we were talking about violence of the disposable ones, about sex workers, violence towards homeless people, violence towards drug users, invisible violence. So I will leave it there in order to go into other questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the answer. I'm going to read the next question for the sake of time. So Jaime Palma asks Jorge, so you said the criminal enterprises are successful because criminals can assure social control better than territorial one. What happens when even urban governments don't have territorial control over their territorial boundaries? It is because criminals have social control on those territories that territorial governments can't have an effective security policy against organized crime groups? Or is it because that when two or more municipalities can't control their boundaries, that organized crime group is successful in social control in those places?
Thanks. So I think it's kind of halfway between these two options. Because in Latin America, I think that criminal governance has like 2 or 3 manifestations. The first of it is that criminal governance as a self-help mechanism, as a way of ordering the social context or performing security or justice there where the state can't do it for several reasons. The second of it is criminal governance as a manifestation of collusion. And I think that there's plenty of evidence, for example, Alexandra Abello's work on Medellin, showing how in Latin America, the state has to kind of negotiate with extra-legal groups, don't call it criminals, but extra-legal groups of different sort, how to govern, how to perform social control. And that has turned into like 3 kinds of criminal governance or manifestation of these kind of social controls. First of all, criminal groups providing services at the local level. That's why I state that it's so important to rely on the street level bureaucracies in order to, fight crime. Because sometimes like national plans, strategic plans are defined at the very local street level. And that's where actually local everyday arrangements between criminals and the state take place. The second one is criminals as local governance arrangements. So for example, you can see it in terms of street justice, public service delivery, public or private security, invisible borders between neighborhoods, the prohibition to rob, to mug, the prohibition to consume drugs at certain hours in certain places. And there's a full variety of ways in which criminals provide this local governance. And the third one, which is very interesting in terms of Alexandra Abello's work on Medellin and other cities, is when criminals pose as citizens, or for example, participatory budget, and they start to capture the state at the local level. And I think that kind of challenges the traditional perspective on organized crime as a non-political phenomenon. Because in the case of Latin America, I do think that organized crime should be studied as a form of political violence.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you very much for that question. Again, I remind you all, if you want to make a question, you can do it in the chat and we'll read it. So the next question is from Carolina Sampo about the Mexican presentation. Are the causes of violence are them independent? Where is no link? Okay, so Carolina is asking if there's a link between the causes of violence. Yes, there's a link between the causes of violence, and each type of violence in each country has different links in between. For example, one cartel can have inter-cartel violence in which one cartel is warring another cartel. And then this cartel B, for example, will ally with some of the criminal gangs in the area or criminal gangs in the other cartel's area to start fighting back. And then the other cartel will do the same thing with other criminal organizations. And then you will end up having not only a conflict between cartel A and cartel B, but you will also have a conflict between gang A and gang B, which are helping the cartels. So most of the violence and the causes of violence are interlinked, but each violence type in each state and in each case has different interrelations. So that's from each case. That's what I can say. Thanks, Carolina, for your question. Unfortunately, we are running out of time right now. So we thank you very much for all your participation. And thank you for listening to us today. For those of you who are interested in contacting us, I think I talk for all the speakers when I say you can contact us, or we can also provide our details in the chat. I'm going to type my email in case you're interested, and I suggest, or I think Williams, Natalia, and Jorge are going to do also the same. And well, thank you very much. And well, with that note, we conclude this presentation, and we're really happy to see all of you in this Global Initiative Conference.
You were listening to Latin American Drug Crimes. If you'd like to get more information on this topic and the speakers, head over to the conference website, oc24.globalinitiative.net. There you can also find videos of most of the talks, including a number of discussions that are not part of this podcast series. This was the 24-hour Conference on Global Organised Crime podcast. I'm Jack Megan Vickers. Thanks for listening.